It was a cold winter evening, colder than usual. The kind of cold that makes the world feel far away, distant and harsh. The wind howled through the streets, biting at the skin, cutting through layers of clothing as though they were paper. It wasn't just chilly, it was the kind of cold that freezes your breath in the air, each inhale a sharp reminder of how cruel the world could be in the winter months. The city was quieter than usual. The streets, usually filled with the sounds of people hurrying home after a long day of work, were nearly silent. The snow had started to fall a few hours ago, at first light and soft, but by now it had built up, thick and heavy, covering everything in a blanket of white. Street lamps flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows across the empty roads. But even in the silence of the snow, Michael Carter kept walking. He was just an ordinary man, heading home from another long and tiring day at work. His mind was heavy with thoughts of the job he had just left behind, of the problems he had to solve, and of the day-to-day struggles that seemed never-ending. His boots crunched the snow beneath him as he walked down the narrow, dimly lit streets. Michael wasn't anything special, not really. He was a simple man who worked as a clerk in a small office. His life was routine work, eat, sleep, and repeat. He didn't think much of himself, and neither did anyone else. He wasn't the type to stand out in a crowd, the kind of person you'd easily forget if you met him. But on this cold winter evening, something was about to happen that would change his life in a way he never expected. As he walked, head down to shield himself from the biting wind, something strange caught his attention. A soft sound. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make him pause. A faint whimper, distant but clear. It almost sounded like a cry for help, but from where? Michael stopped in his tracks. He turned his head, scanning the street for any sign of movement. There was nothing, just snow, and the distant sound of wind. But then, the whimper came again. This time, he was sure it was real. A small sound, like an animal in pain. Without thinking, he started to walk toward the sound. His heart began to race. What was it? A lost cat? A dog? Maybe someone was hurt, and he needed to help. His mind raced with possibilities, but he knew he had to find the source. The sound led him down an alleyway, dark and narrow. The street lights didn't reach this far, and the only light came from the faint glow of the city far behind him. The cold air seemed even sharper here, more biting, as if the alley itself was holding the chill longer than the rest of the town. Michael shivered as he stepped forward, trying to stay calm. Then he saw it. A small figure huddled on the ground, its body curled up, trembling against the cold. Michael couldn't make out exactly what it was at first, but as he stepped closer, he could see it more clearly. A dog, its fur matted with ice, shivering violently. Its eyes were barely open, and its breathing was shallow and uneven. The poor animal was frozen, nearly lifeless, struggling to stay conscious. It was clear that the dog had been out in the cold for far too long. Michael's heart dropped. He couldn't just leave it there. The dog needed help. It was freezing, and it wouldn't survive much longer in this condition. Without thinking, he dropped to his knees, gently reaching out for the small animal. The dog didn't move at first, too weak to even notice his presence. Michael moved carefully, not wanting to frighten it. He slowly and gently scooped the dog into his arms. It felt light, fragile, and covered in ice. The dog didn't make a sound as it was lifted. Michael cradled it against his chest, feeling the coldness seep into his clothes. The dog's tiny body was shaking, but there was no sign of resistance. It was too weak to do anything but trust him. As Michael stood up, ready to carry the dog to safety, he glanced down at the creature in his arms. That's when he noticed something strange. There was a faint outline, something that didn't belong, just underneath the dog's body. At first, it was hard to make sense of it. It wasn't just the dog's small frame, there was something else, something hidden, something that didn't quite seem natural. Michael froze. His fingers tightened around the dog instinctively, as if trying to keep it safe, but his mind raced with questions. What was that? Was the dog carrying something? Something that didn't belong on an animal? He turned the dog over gently in his arms, trying to get a better look at whatever was hidden underneath. As he shifted the dog, he saw it more clearly. There, beneath the dog's thin, shivering body, was something strange, something metallic. Michael blinked, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. It looked like a small device, partially hidden under the dog's fur, almost as if it had been placed there on purpose. His breath caught in his throat. What was this? Was it a tracking device? Some kind of hidden equipment? Michael felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. This was no ordinary stray dog. Something was very wrong. With the dog still trembling in his arms, Michael quickly made his way out of the alley and back to the street, trying to stay calm. His mind raced with thoughts. What could this mean? Why would anyone put something like this on a dog? What was going on here? As he walked, his thoughts continued to swirl. The dog's condition was bad, there was no question about that. He had to get it help, fast. But the more he thought about it, the more uneasy he became. Something about the situation just didn't add up. What had he gotten himself into? He hurried to his car, the dog still wrapped carefully in his arms. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of the situation was settling on him with each passing moment. What was he going to do now? Should he just take the dog to the nearest shelter, or was there something more going on that he didn't understand? Michael looked down at the small creature in his arms, its body still shaking. He couldn't help but feel a deep sense of responsibility. He had to know the truth. He had to find out what was really going on. And that meant finding out what was hidden under the dog. As Michael made his way to his car, the little dog in his arms stirred weakly, its breath shallow and slow. The fragile little creature was a mere weight against him, but Michael could feel the chill of its body even through the layers of his jacket. The snow kept falling, drifting lightly over the ground, and the wind had not lessened its bite. Every step he took seemed to draw him further into an uncomfortable quiet. The streets were empty, the only sound was his footsteps and the soft whimper of the dog. He didn't know why, but a strange feeling continued to gnaw at the back of his mind. It wasn't just the concern for the dog's condition, it was something else. Something deeper. The nagging sensation that there was more to this than what appeared on the surface. Why was the dog in this condition? Why was it in that alleyway, alone and freezing? And that strange feeling when he held the dog, as if something was hiding underneath its frail body. Michael shook his head, trying to push the thought away. He needed to focus. The dog's life was in his hands, and he couldn't afford to get lost in doubts now. His car was just a few yards ahead. The warmth of the car's interior seemed like a distant promise of safety. He quickened his pace, his heart beating faster with each step, both for the little dog and the uneasy feeling that kept following him. When he finally reached his car, Michael gently placed the dog into the passenger seat, wrapping it in his jacket for warmth. He had to get the dog help, and fast. His hands trembled as he started the engine, the low rumble of the car's engine sounding louder than usual in the quiet night. He drove faster than he should have, the wheels spinning a little too quickly on the snow-covered roads, but Michael couldn't help it. The thought of the dog alone and suffering in the cold gnawed at his heart. The nearest vet was a small, independent clinic on the edge of town, one that Michael had passed 100 times but never had any reason to visit. The lights were on, which gave him a small sense of relief. He pulled into the parking lot and parked right outside the door. His fingers were stiff, but he managed to grab the dog gently and carry it inside, hoping they would know what to do. As soon as he entered, the cold air of the night seemed to slip off his shoulders, replaced by the warmth of the clinic. The waiting room was empty, save for a few magazines scattered on a small table, and the faint sound of a television playing softly in the background. The receptionist sat behind a counter, her head bent low, her eyes focused on the phone in her hands. Michael walked up to the counter, his voice soft but urgent. "I found this dog outside. It's in bad shape. It needs help." The receptionist didn't look up immediately. She continued scrolling through her phone, her fingers tapping quickly across the screen. "Just leave it in the back. We'll handle it," she muttered, barely glancing at him. Her tone was uninterested, almost dismissive, and it made Michael pause for a second. He cleared his throat, trying to keep his voice steady despite the rising discomfort in his chest. "Are you sure you can help it?" His voice betrayed the slight tremor he felt inside. The receptionist finally looked up, her eyes narrowing as if irritated by the interruption. She paused for a moment, studying Michael's face. Her eyes seemed to linger longer than necessary, but then she smiled in a way that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Of course. We're professionals," she said, her words clipped and curt. Without another word, she turned away, gesturing vaguely toward the back room. Michael stood there for a moment, his heart beating a little faster. Something about the way she spoke, her tone so flat, so cold, sent a shiver down his spine. It didn't sit right with him. It was like she wasn't really paying attention to him, to the urgency of the situation, or to the life that was struggling in his arms. He could feel it, the tension hanging in the air, but he couldn't put his finger on it. For a second, Michael thought about leaving, taking the dog somewhere else. Maybe a better place. A place that would care more. But the clinic was the closest option, and the dog needed help now. The cold was still sharp in the night air, and he didn't want to risk losing precious time. With a deep breath, he walked toward the back room where the receptionist had gestured. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe he was just being paranoid, but Michael's instincts were telling him to be cautious. He walked past a few empty examination rooms, their doors slightly ajar. The scent of antiseptic and disinfectant filled the air, a smell that should have been reassuring in a place like this. But it only added to the unease creeping up his spine. The hall seemed too quiet, too still, as if the place were empty despite the receptionist in the front. Michael turned a corner, stopping at a room marked Examination Room 3. He pushed the door open and stepped inside, cradling the dog in his arms. The room was sterile and bright, with an examination table in the center and a few tools on the counter. There was no one here, not even a nurse or assistant to greet him. The silence was unsettling, and Michael felt his skin prickle with unease. He waited for a moment, the dog still in his arms, its small body barely moving now. It was weak, exhausted. Michael felt a pang of guilt. He should have gotten it help sooner. He couldn't afford to waste any more time. He opened his mouth to call out for someone, but just as he did, the door creaked open behind him. A man in a white coat entered the room, his expression unreadable. He was tall, with dark hair and sharp features. He looked at Michael briefly, but didn't say anything right away. His eyes flicked to the dog in Michael's arms, then back to him. "Just leave it here. We'll take it from here," the man said, his voice low and controlled. Michael hesitated, his grip tightening around the dog instinctively. Something about the man's demeanor felt off. His voice wasn't warm or reassuring. It was flat. Cold. I just want to make sure it's okay," Michael said, his voice shaking. "I don't know what happened to it. It was freezing outside. I think it needs more than just a quick checkup." The man's lips twitched in a slight, almost imperceptible smile. It didn't reach his eyes. "We're equipped for situations like this," he said, his tone still distant. "Just leave it on the table. We'll handle it." Michael felt a tightening in his chest, an unfamiliar sense of dread creeping into his thoughts. There was something about the way the man spoke, the way he refused to make eye contact for too long. It wasn't just unprofessional, it was unsettling. But Michael couldn't leave. The dog needed help, and this was the best place, wasn't it? "I'll stay," Michael said, his voice firm despite the fear bubbling in his stomach. "I'm not leaving until I know it's going to be all right." The man's expression darkened, just for a moment, but he didn't argue. Instead, he stepped aside and gestured for Michael to place the dog on the examination table. Michael did so carefully, still watching the man. He stepped back, but the strange feeling didn't go away. It grew. There was something wrong with this place. Something hidden beneath the surface. As the man began to examine the dog, Michael noticed the receptionist standing just outside the room, watching them both, her eyes glinting in a way that didn't seem friendly. Michael's heart raced. He couldn't explain it, but everything felt off. The way they were both acting, the coldness in their voices, it was like they were hiding something. Michael swallowed hard. He didn't know what was going on, but he felt trapped. There was no way to leave now, not without answers. But in his gut, he knew one thing: whatever this place was hiding, it was about to come to light, and Michael was right in the middle of it. He had made a choice. And now he was going to have to live with it. As the hours dragged on, Michael found himself pacing the small, sterile waiting room of the clinic. The dim light overhead flickered every few seconds, adding to the tension that already hung in the air. His thoughts were consumed by the dog. He couldn't stop replaying that strange moment when he first found it in the alley, lying shivering and alone. The image of its frail little body curled up in the snow haunted him. Something about it didn't sit right. The way it looked so helpless, the way its eyes seemed to say something more than just pain and fear. It was as if the dog had a story it couldn't share. The feeling in the pit of Michael's stomach grew heavier by the minute. Why had he found this dog? What had brought it to that alley, to that cold, lonely place? The silence of the waiting room pressed in on him. He couldn't help but glance at the clock on the wall every few seconds. Time seemed to stretch on endlessly, each tick of the second hand pulling him deeper into his own thoughts. The vet had told him to wait, to give them time to check on the dog. But Michael wasn't sure how much longer he could stay in this uncomfortable silence. He couldn't even explain it, but it felt like something was wrong. More wrong than just a stray dog needing help. There was something beneath the surface, something hidden just out of sight. Michael kept going over the events in his mind, retracing his steps, trying to piece everything together. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't figure it out. Suddenly, the door to the back room opened, and the vet's voice cut through the air, shaking with tension. "Mr. Carter? There's something you should see." Michael's heart skipped a beat. The moment the words left her mouth, a chill ran down his spine. What could possibly be so important? Was the dog okay? Had something gone wrong? His mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. He stood up quickly, his legs stiff from the long hours of sitting, and hurried toward the back room. He pushed the door open and stepped inside, his breath catching in his throat. The dog was still lying on the exam table, its body still frail and weak, but now it had been shaved in spots, revealing patches of pale, almost translucent skin. Michael's stomach twisted as he saw the strange markings on the dog's skin, lines that looked almost like tattoos or scars. But that wasn't what made his breath catch in his chest. No. It was what lay underneath the dog. As the vet gently moved the animal, Michael saw it. A hidden compartment. The dog's fragile form had been concealing it. As the vet pulled the dog back just enough to reveal it, Michael's mind struggled to comprehend what he was seeing. The compartment was small, like a secret pocket within the dog's body, hidden away beneath its fur. It wasn't something that belonged there. The dog wasn't just a stray, wasn't just a helpless animal lost in the cold. There was something hidden beneath its frailty, something placed there intentionally. The compartment was made of some sort of metallic material, faintly glinting under the fluorescent lights. Michael took a step back, his mind racing. The world seemed to tilt slightly as the shock set in. "Is this a joke?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He felt a lump in his throat, a sense of disbelief that twisted his thoughts and made it hard to breathe. The vet's eyes were wide with shock. She stood frozen, staring at the hidden compartment under the dog's skin. "I don't know what this is," she murmured, her voice low and shaky. "But this is not normal." Michael's mind struggled to process what he was seeing. What kind of dog was this? How had it ended up in his arms? And what in the world was hidden inside its body? His questions swirled in a chaotic storm of confusion and fear. The vet gently touched the metallic compartment, her fingers brushing the smooth surface. "I've never seen anything like this before," she whispered, more to herself than to Michael. "What is it? What does this mean?" Michael shook his head, his eyes not leaving the compartment. "I don't know. But it's not a regular dog, is it?" The vet didn't answer immediately. She seemed lost in her own thoughts, staring at the strange object that had been hidden beneath the dog's frail body. Then, slowly, she stepped back, her hands still trembling as she moved away. "We need to get this out of here. We can't leave it like this." Michael's stomach churned. "What are you going to do?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The vet didn't reply right away. Instead, she moved toward a counter filled with medical tools, her hands shaking as she pulled out a small scalpel. She glanced back at Michael. "We'll try to remove it," she said, though her voice lacked the confidence it should have had in a professional setting. "But, we don't know what we're dealing with." Michael stood in stunned silence as she prepared to operate. His thoughts were racing. What was this thing? Why had it been hidden under the dog's skin? And who had done this to the animal? His mind refused to stay still. His heart pounded in his chest, the thudding of it echoing in his ears as the vet positioned herself beside the dog. Michael watched, unable to tear his eyes away from the scene before him. But then, just as the vet was about to make her incision, something strange happened. The dog's body suddenly stiffened, its muscles going rigid as if in shock. The vet paused, her hand hovering over the dog's skin, her face pale with confusion. Michael's breath caught in his throat. "What's happening?" he asked, his voice sharp with panic. "Why is it like this?" The vet didn't respond. Instead, she leaned in closer to the dog, her eyes scanning the animal's body for any signs of distress. Her brow furrowed as she noticed something even stranger. The markings on the dog's skin were shifting. The lines seemed to be moving, almost like they were alive, reacting to the vet's touch. Michael's stomach turned. His mind was reeling, his body frozen in place. He had no idea what he was witnessing, but it felt wrong, deeply wrong. And the worst part was that he didn't know who or what was behind all of this. The vet's voice was barely a whisper. "Something's not right," she muttered, more to herself than to Michael. "We need to get this thing out of here. Now." Michael's thoughts scrambled as he tried to make sense of everything that was happening. The dog, the strange markings, the hidden compartment, none of it made sense. And yet, deep down, he knew this was no accident. Someone had put this dog in this condition. Someone had placed this strange object inside its body on purpose. He wasn't just dealing with an abandoned animal anymore. He was caught up in something far bigger than he could have ever imagined. His pulse quickened, and the weight of the situation settled over him like a heavy fog. This wasn't just a stray dog. This was something else. Something that was going to change his life in ways he couldn't yet understand. Michael swallowed hard. He had made a choice when he decided to help the dog. And now, it seemed that choice would lead him down a dark path, a path he couldn't turn back from. As the vet continued her examination, the small, hidden compartment remained a mystery, and Michael could only wonder how deep the secrets went. What was it that lay beneath the surface? And who, or what, was behind it all? As the minutes ticked by, Michael's heart raced faster with each unanswered question, each revelation that only seemed to raise more. He knew one thing for sure: he wasn't walking away from this without uncovering the truth. Michael's hands trembled as he leaned closer, his eyes fixed on the metallic object beneath the dog. His breath caught in his throat as he reached out, his fingers lightly brushing the cool surface. The device was small but undeniably strange. It looked like some sort of intricate, high-tech gadget, almost like a piece of equipment that didn't belong in this world, a world where stray dogs wandered the streets in need of help, not hidden secrets waiting to be uncovered. His pulse raced as he carefully pulled the object free from beneath the dog's frail body. It was smooth, shiny, and far too advanced for anything he had ever encountered. The more he examined it, the more the unease gnawed at him. It didn't make sense. This was supposed to be a simple rescue, a simple act of kindness, and yet here he was, holding something that could change everything. The vet, still standing by the table, took a small step back. Her face was pale, her lips pressed tightly together in fear. "I've never seen anything like this before," she muttered again, her voice trembling. Michael's mind raced as the silence in the room deepened. He turned the device over in his hands, his fingers trembling as he felt its weight. It wasn't just a random piece of junk, it was a deliberate object, something that had been placed there with purpose. But why? And who would do such a thing to an innocent dog? Where did this come from? Michael demanded, his voice rising with a mix of fear and frustration. His chest tightened, and he could feel the blood rushing to his head as his thoughts scrambled for answers. What is this thing? And why was it inside the dog? The vet swallowed hard, glancing nervously at the device and then back at Michael. She shook her head, her hands shaking at her sides. I don't know," she stammered. It's too strange. I've never seen anything like it." Michael felt a sharp pang of frustration. He wanted answers. He needed answers. But none were forthcoming. The vet seemed just as confused as he was, and that only made the situation feel more dangerous. He turned back to the dog, who was still lying motionless on the table, its eyes closed. The poor animal's body was fragile, broken, and still so vulnerable. Michael felt an overwhelming wave of protectiveness for it. What had this dog been through? And who was behind it all? He glanced at the device again, the strange markings etched into its surface. It looked almost like a map, or perhaps a code. His fingers traced the edges, hoping that something might give him a clue as to what it was or why it was hidden beneath the dog's skin. But there were no answers. Only more questions. Suddenly, a soft beep broke the heavy silence in the room. Michael jumped, his heart racing. He looked down at the device in his hands. The light on it flickered, and the device began to hum, sending a small vibration through his fingertips. Is it turning on?" Michael whispered, his voice filled with disbelief. The vet took a tentative step forward, her eyes wide. "It can't be," she said in a low voice. "That's impossible. That thing shouldn't be able to work." But it was working. The device was coming to life in his hands, the soft beeping continuing as small lights on the surface began to flicker on and off in a rhythmic pattern. Michael felt a chill run down his spine. Something was happening, something he didn't understand, but he could sense that it was important. "What the hell is going on?" Michael muttered, his mind racing. "What is this thing?" As if in response to his question, the device suddenly clicked, and a small panel on the side of it slid open. Michael's breath caught in his throat as a tiny, hidden screen flickered to life. The screen displayed a series of strange numbers and symbols, none of which he recognized. They seemed to be in some sort of code, long strings of letters and numbers that made no sense at all. He felt a surge of panic. What was he supposed to do with this? Why was it hidden inside the dog? And most importantly, who had done this? The vet stepped closer, peering at the screen with wide eyes. This is some kind of technology, she said, her voice almost a whisper. But it's beyond anything we know. I've never seen anything like this before. Michael's mind was spinning. He couldn't comprehend it. The dog, the device, it was all too much. His mind kept returning to one question that refused to leave him: what did it mean? Suddenly, a voice broke through his thoughts. It was soft at first, like a whisper, but then it grew louder, clearer. The words weren't coming from anyone in the room, but from somewhere else entirely. Michael. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. The voice was familiar, but it couldn't be. It was a voice he hadn't heard in years. Michael. The voice repeated his name again, this time more urgently, as if trying to get his attention. Michael's heart pounded in his chest as the room seemed to close in around him. His hands tightened around the device as he looked around in confusion. Was he imagining this? Had he finally lost his mind? The voice came again, but this time it was clearer, more distinct. Michael, listen to me. You need to understand. This is bigger than you realize. Michael's blood ran cold. He wasn't imagining this. The voice was real, and it was coming from the device. But who was it? And why were they speaking to him? Who are you? Michael whispered, his voice shaky. He felt a cold sweat break out on his skin as the room seemed to grow darker. The words on the screen flickered, almost as if they were shifting in response to his question. You don't know me, but I know you. This device is the key. It's not just a tool. It's a message. Michael's mind raced. A message? A key? What was happening? He glanced at the vet, who was still staring at the device in shock. She hadn't heard the voice. But Michael had. He was certain of it. The voice continued, its tone more insistent now. You need to follow the trail. The truth is out there, and it's connected to you. Michael's eyes widened in horror. What truth? What trail? He couldn't even understand what was happening right now, let alone follow some mysterious trail. The voice went silent for a moment, and the screen went dark. The room was eerily still. Michael stood frozen, his hands still gripping the device, his heart racing in his chest. The vet cleared her throat, her voice breaking the silence. What just happened? Michael, did you hear that? Michael didn't respond immediately. He was still too stunned, too shaken by what he had just experienced. He glanced at the vet, but she was looking at him with confusion and concern. Had anyone else heard the voice? Was it real? He swallowed hard, trying to make sense of it all. The device, the strange symbols, the voice, it was all too much. But he knew one thing for sure. His life had just been turned upside down. What had started as a simple act of kindness had now spiraled into something far bigger and far more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. And this was only the beginning. The dog, the device, the voice, everything was connected. But how? Michael didn't know yet, but he was determined to find out. There was no turning back now. The revelation of the device sent shockwaves through Michael's entire world. What he had thought was a simple rescue mission for an abandoned dog had turned into something so much larger, something much more sinister. The discovery of the small, metallic object hidden under the dog's skin had only been the beginning. The device was a tracker, a high-tech piece of equipment designed to follow its target wherever they went. And now, Michael was the target. But who had placed the device there? Who was watching him? These were questions that needed answers, And fortunately, Michael wasn't alone in his quest for the truth. After he handed over the device to the authorities, the gears of investigation began to turn rapidly. They were as baffled as Michael at first, but as they delved deeper into the mystery, things began to take shape. It wasn't long before the authorities realized just how dangerous the situation really was. The device wasn't just an ordinary tracker, it was sophisticated, a piece of technology far beyond anything the average person could have access to. It had been carefully designed to be undetectable, hidden in plain sight under the dog's fur and skin. Whoever had used this device had gone to extreme lengths to ensure that it wouldn't be discovered until it was too late. Michael couldn't help but feel a chill run down his spine as he thought about it. For how long had he been watched? And by whom? The answer came quickly enough. As the authorities continued their investigation, they uncovered a connection to a major underground operation, an illegal animal trafficking ring. It turned out that the little dog Michael had rescued was far more than just a stray animal in need of help. It was a key player in a much larger scheme, and the device was the key to it all. The dog had been used to smuggle critical information, hidden within the device, under layers of fur and skin. The poor creature had been caught in the middle of something dangerous and illegal, all while appearing to be nothing more than a sad stray. The discovery of the device had revealed the truth: the dog had been used to carry sensitive data for the traffickers. And the fact that Michael had found it in time had made all the difference. As the investigation deepened, the authorities uncovered even more shocking details. The animal trafficking ring wasn't just dealing in the illegal sale of animals, it was much more than that. The traffickers had been using these animals to transport information across the country, smuggling high-tech gadgets and confidential data under their fur, often unnoticed by the very people who were supposed to be caring for them. The use of animals as mules in this way was a horrifying practice that had gone unnoticed for far too long. But now that the truth had come to light, the authorities were ready to act. The operation was swiftly raided, and dozens of animals that had been trapped in this cruel system were freed. They were no longer just innocent creatures caught in the crossfire, they were now survivors, given a second chance at life. And Michael, though he had been an unsuspecting hero, was now at the center of a massive rescue effort. The authorities arrested those responsible for the trafficking ring, ruthless individuals who had been profiting off the suffering of animals and the exploitation of technology. The police made several high-profile arrests, and the news spread quickly, catching the attention of the media and the public alike. It was a major victory for those who had been fighting against animal cruelty and illegal trafficking, and the sense of justice that followed was overwhelming. But for Michael, the victory was bittersweet. He had never expected any of this. He had just wanted to help a dog in need, to make sure it wasn't left to freeze in the cold. Instead, he had found himself entangled in a web of conspiracy and crime, a victim of forces far beyond his control. Still, Michael couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. The truth had come out. The people responsible for the horrors the animals had endured were finally facing justice. And the little dog, the creature that had started it all, was now safe and free from the horrors it had endured. As Michael stood outside the police station, watching as the authorities handled the aftermath of the raid, he felt a strange sense of closure. He had been thrust into a world he didn't understand, a world filled with secrets and lies. But now, that world was starting to make sense. The mysteries were unraveling, and the villains were being exposed for who they truly were. Michael couldn't help but think back to the moment he had first found the dog in that dark alley, trembling and alone. At the time, he had never imagined that simple act of kindness would lead to something so massive, so dangerous. He had been just an ordinary man, trying to make his way home. But in helping that dog, he had become part of something much bigger. The small, fragile creature in his arms had turned out to be a symbol of something much more than he could have ever anticipated. It had been the key to bringing down a criminal operation, to freeing animals that had been trapped and exploited for far too long. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the scene, Michael couldn't help but feel proud. He had done the right thing. He had acted with compassion, with kindness. And in doing so, he had helped to bring about change. The little dog, which had once been cold and abandoned in the snow, was now safe. And Michael, too, had found peace in knowing that justice had been served. But that wasn't the end of the story. The raid had uncovered a network of people involved in the trafficking ring, and though many were arrested, the authorities knew there was still more work to be done. Michael, though no longer in danger, had unwittingly become a key witness in the investigation. His story had become a vital part of the larger fight against animal cruelty and illegal trafficking. As he stood there, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Michael thought about the journey he had been on. From the moment he found the dog to the moment the authorities had uncovered the full extent of the operation, everything had changed. His life would never be the same again. And though he had been thrust into a world of danger and uncertainty, he had emerged on the other side as a hero. A quiet hero, perhaps, but a hero nonetheless. He had acted when others might have ignored the problem, and in doing so, he had made a difference. The story of the dog, the device, and the trafficking ring would be remembered for years to come. Michael's name would not fade into obscurity. He had played a vital role in something much larger than himself, something that had affected countless lives. As he walked away from the police station, Michael felt the weight of the world lift from his shoulders. He had helped bring justice, and now, he could finally start to live his life again knowing that he had made a real difference. And as for the dog, well, it had a new home now, a warm place to sleep, and a bright future ahead of it. It was no longer a victim of a cruel system. It was free. As Michael stood outside the animal shelter, watching the newly rescued animals run and play, he couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened. It had all started with a simple act of kindness, a decision to help a freezing dog in the middle of a cold, silent night. Now, months later, everything had changed. The shelter around him was filled with animals, all given a second chance at life, all saved because of what he had started. What had begun as an ordinary evening for him had turned into a mission of discovery, justice, and hope. He watched as the dogs and cats bounded around the yard, their joy a stark contrast to the fear and suffering they had known before being rescued. Each one had a story. Each one had been through something unimaginable. But now, they were free. Now, they were safe. Michael couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He had been part of something larger than himself. He had acted on instinct, on compassion, and that had set off a chain of events that had saved so many lives. But as he stood there, taking in the peaceful sight of the shelter, he couldn't forget the lessons he had learned along the way. Sometimes, it only takes one person to make a difference. Sometimes, it only takes one moment of courage to change everything. When he first found the dog, shivering and alone in the alley, Michael had no idea what he was walking into. All he knew was that he couldn't just walk away. He had to help. And that small decision had led him down a path he never could have predicted. At first, it had been overwhelming. The discovery of the tracker. The sinister forces at work behind the scenes. The realization that he had unknowingly become part of something dangerous. It had felt like everything was spinning out of control, like he was caught in the middle of something much bigger than he could understand. But through it all, he had stayed focused on what mattered. He had stayed true to his purpose to help the dog, to save the animals, to bring the truth to light. In the end, that simple decision had made all the difference. Michael had learned that sometimes, doing the right thing isn't easy. It doesn't always feel like a heroic act in the moment. Sometimes, it just feels like the only thing you can do. But in the end, it's the small acts of kindness that have the power to change the world. It's the quiet choices, made in the face of uncertainty, that can uncover hidden truths and bring about real change. As he watched the animals in the yard, Michael couldn't help but think of how many more people could make a difference if they just took that first step. if they just acted on their compassion. The world was full of suffering, full of injustice. But it was also full of people who cared. People who wanted to make a difference. And sometimes, it only takes one person to spark that change. Michael had never seen himself as a hero. He was just an ordinary man, trying to get home after a long day of work. But now, he realized that sometimes, being a hero isn't about grand gestures or dramatic moments. Sometimes, it's about doing what's right, even when it's hard. It's about standing up for those who can't stand up for themselves, even when you don't know what's waiting for you on the other side. The truth had been hidden in plain sight. It had been there all along, waiting to be uncovered. And it was a reminder that the world is full of secrets. Some are dark, some are painful, but many are beautiful. Michael's journey had started with a dog, but it had ended with the revelation of something so much greater. It had ended with the rescue of so many animals, the arrest of those responsible for their suffering, and the beginning of a new chapter for so many lives. And that was the most important lesson of all. Sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness, like rescuing a freezing dog from the streets, can uncover the darkest secrets. And in the end, it's not just about saving lives. Sometimes, it's about revealing truths that no one was ever meant to see. It was a reminder that the world is full of hidden surprises, waiting to be uncovered. And sometimes, what you find beneath the surface is far more important than what you first see. Michael smiled softly as he watched a small dog, one of the rescues, chase after a ball, its tail wagging with pure joy. The animal was free. It was no longer trapped in a cruel system. It was safe, and it was happy. And in that moment, Michael realized something profound. The world might not always make sense. There would always be darkness, and there would always be challenges. But if each person did their part, if each person acted with kindness, then the world could be made better. One small act at a time. It didn't take a hero. It just took a person who cared. As the sun began to set behind the shelter, casting a warm glow across the yard, Michael turned to walk away. His heart was full, his spirit light. The journey had been difficult, but it had been worth it. He had made a difference. And that was all that mattered. Sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness can change the world.